We are going to move into chapter 19 of the book of John this morning, and we're going to be looking still at Pilate. And the interesting thing is, we've been talking about Pilate now for a few weeks, and he'll never be mentioned again in the New Testament. After this, it's over. And we're going to look at a lot of verses this morning, and I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do that. Bert's going to scroll those verses. I'm going to read some of them, and I'm going to inject some things. I'm not sure how I'll follow, but you can follow these 16 verses of John chapter 19 as Pilate continues to deal with Jesus. But he's already been talking to Jesus. Everyone remember how he's been talking to Jesus? And it's been civil. And it's almost been as though Jesus has already won Pilate over to be on his side. Pilate can see that the charges the Jewish leadership have made are unfounded. Jesus has not done anything worthy of death. I think he can probably see that the trial that the Jews had was unjust, illegal. Jesus had no representation. And he does not want to crucify Jesus. And even before you get to chapter 19, he's trying to figure out, how do I get around this? And so he'll stand before the Jews outside of his palace, and he'll say, it's the Passover. And you know at Passover, it is customary that I would release one of your own who I have in jail and let them go free. Now he's thinking, they'll surely choose Jesus. But you know what they begin to cry out? They begin to cry out, Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. And Barabbas was a known resurrectionist. He is a rebel. He's the last person you want walking on the streets of Jerusalem. And Pilate's bewildered. They want Barabbas to go free? And this man, Jesus, I can't find anything wrong. So he begins to do another thing to try to manipulate the situation, to try to avoid the crucifixion. And that's where he picked the story up now, beginning in chapter 19 and verse 1. And you're not going to like it as we begin. Because Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, and they went up to him again and again, saying, Hail the King of the Jews! And they slapped him in the face. And I want you to pause there and think about the flogging, the scourging, as it's often called. This is a Roman scourging. And if I understand it correctly, they would take a person's clothes off and lay them across as though it were the stump of a tree. And they would stretch out the arms and they would tie each hand tightly. And they would stretch out the legs and tie each leg tightly. And you have this whip that's made of many strands. And at the end of each strand, there is embedded a piece of bone or glass or something that is designed to sever the flesh. And it's not just a beating on the back. It is a full body scourging. So that the whips come across over and over again, across the back of the legs, across the top of the shoulders, and come around and grab a hold of the face and cut the face. It was a near-death experience. A near-death experience to go through a Roman scourging. And it's amazing to me that Jesus will endure all that. He did not have to. He did not have to, but he did it for us. He did it to complete his assignment. And as if the scourging were not enough, these soldiers don't care about humanity. They don't care about treating people decently. And you read stories about that often certain kind of prison situations. And so they mock him. They mock him. The purple robe is a sign of kingship. And they put it on him. And instead of a crown of gold, they take the crown of thorns and they crush it on his head. And over, they will say, "Hail the King of the Jews," and they'll slap him. And now it's Pilate's turn to re-enter. Look at the next verses. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns, purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Now watch those words, because Pilate, again, is very, very methodical, very careful. He's bringing out a man who's been beaten almost to death. He's allowing the mockery to continue. And no longer does he say, "Here is your king." Now he says, "Just look at the man." He's trying to diffuse the situation. And he is hoping that the Jews will look upon this sight. Do any of you remember the old movie, The Passion of the Christ? One of the highest grossing films. I guess it is the highest grossing film ever been made. Mel Gibson produced it. I only remember one scene, and it was the scourging. And tears rolled out of my eyes, and I couldn't watch it all as I sat in that movie theater. And now Pilate stands him up in that condition in front of the people, mocking him or allowing him to be mocked, and saying, "Here is the man," and thinking this time they will surely say, "It's enough. We've done enough." The compassion would begin to fill their hearts. He's had enough. But as soon as the chief priest and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify." And then more loudly, "Crucify." But Pilate answered, "Then you take him and you crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." Pilate's really trying. The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law." They had a lot of laws. We have a law. According to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, what they're claiming there is that Jesus is blaspheming God. I went back and tried to look at that old law. What are they talking about? He's blaspheming the Son of God. Blaspheming God himself by saying he's the Son of God. And the word blaspheme, as best I could determine, just means gross disrespect. It's the kind of thing where you say, God is make-believe, and God has no power, and your God is weak, and you just say those kind of things about God. Jesus never did anything like that. All he ever did was say, "My Father, hallowed be your name." When you talk to him that way. And Jesus would say, "Everything that I've ever spoken, my Father told me to say it." He never did anything but give glory and honor to the God who created the world. But the Jews, they take their little religion things, they twist them all up to get what they want and to have things exactly the way they want them. And you have to be so careful with that. And they say, he claims to be the Son of God. And it's broken our law. So we want him to die because of it. And if this were the first time you've ever read this story, wouldn't you see through all of this? Now we continue to read. Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid and went back into the palace. He's really getting disturbed by this. Now, if you go over to the book of Matthew and chapter 27, what you're going to read is that in the midst of all this, Pilate's wife gets involved from a distance. And she will write out a message. And she will send the message to her husband and say, I've had a dream about this thing you're going through. I've had a dream about this man, Jesus. And in my dream, he is a just man. And I don't want you to have anything to do with him. I don't want you to get involved in this at all. Well, that's kind of a disturbing thing, I would think, to Pilate. And now everything he's tried, Barabbas, the scourging, they haven't worked. And now the Jews speak their charge more directly, and it's flimsy, it's wrong. And Pilate goes back into the palace even more afraid. And he looks at Jesus and he says, in this disturbed, you can feel him being so disturbed, where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus didn't answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? And underline that line in your mind. I have the power. I can release you. No matter what those Jews say, I can release you. Or I can crucify you. Now it's even worse for Pilate, because look at what Jesus says. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. What do you think Pilate thought? You don't have any power over me, except my Father, whom they say I'm blaspheming, gives it to you. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Now, that is the compassion of Jesus. Beaten almost to death, mocked and slapped, and he sees what Pilate is going through. And he kind of lifts the load off Pilate a little bit and said, the people who handed you over to me have the greater sin in all this. It's Jesus being the kind of man that Jesus is and always will be. And now we continue. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting. And what they shout this time is the hardest thing they shout to Pilate. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Now you have to stretch back your mind for a moment, because a couple of weeks ago we said that Pilate and the Jews did not like each other. Anyone remember that? They do not like each other. And they've had all kinds of conflicts in the time that Pilate has been a Roman governor. And Pilate has used a heavy hand on the Jews more than once. And they have complained to Caesar more than once. And it is alleged that Pilate even built an aqueduct system in the city of Jerusalem, and he funded that by taking money out of the temple treasury. It caused a major uproar. And now they say, we have a problem in this deal, and it's going to go all the way to Caesar. Caesar's going to hear about this, Pilate. And Pilate can't stand one more problem with Tiberius Caesar. In fact, we know from history, he had been recalled. In the end of this story, he had been recalled. He's on his way back to Rome to meet face to face with Tiberius. But Tiberius dies while he's en route. And so now the political pressure comes. Before it's been moral pressure. If Pilate had a conscience, he certainly showed it, at least this once in the time he dealt with Jesus. So when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat as a place known as a stone pavement, whatever the other word is I can't pronounce. It was a day of preparation for the Passover. It was about noon. Here is your king. This time, not your man. Here is your king. And they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. Are you sure you want me to do this? We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. And finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And it's the end of Pilate. It's the last you read about him. So I want you to think for a moment, if you were going to stand here and talk about these 16 verses, and you're going to try to apply them to our lives this morning, what are the conclusions that you would draw? What is your own conclusion of this story? Well, as I think only about Pilate, for a while, I kind of like him. For a while, I feel really sorry for him. And for a while, I get really disgusted with him. And here's the reason why I get disgusted with him. And I want you to be really careful, because my reason is so common that I've been guilty of it, and likely so have you. Here's the reason. He did not have the courage to stand for what he knew was right. He simply did not have the courage to stand for what he knew was right. Do all of you see that? And so often in this life, that's where we find ourselves. So often. When we were really young, if you can remember back when you were a teenager, we called it peer pressure. And what we meant by that was you might be a young person and you might know exactly the right thing to do. You might have this feeling about what the right thing to do is, but all the other people, they're going a different direction. And if you don't go along with them, you stand out as different. And that's not a good feeling, especially when you're a teenager. And not just that. Then they begin to talk about you. And they may begin to bully you. And it's real hard to take that. And so I, as a young man, would give up. And I would go in a direction that I knew was not right, because I didn't have the courage to stand. But that's not just for teenagers, is it? So you go through your 20s and your 30s, and I have a word that I give for each decade of life. And if I would give you my word for the 30s, I would say it's striving, and they're out there striving, trying to get ahead in their career and trying to make a place for themselves in their career. And these young families are looking down the street and seeing the kind of cars that their neighbors are driving and seeing the kind of house they're living in, and they're trying to keep up with everybody, and they go more and more in debt, and they make life so. Every time you have the courage, or you fail to have the courage to stand, it doesn't turn out well. But we have the same pressures in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and it goes on throughout all life. And then you add political pressures into it. You know, we get in certain organizations and we have to walk the way they walk. And you used to go into a corporation, you used to dress a certain way. It's the same color suit, it's the same kind of tie. Now they don't care about any of that kind of stuff. But it used to be. They have certain things you have to conform to. And sometimes those things can form over into the areas of morality, and there's politics involved in everything. And sometimes people try to get you to conform to their way of thinking, and they believe with all their might that it's the right way. I have told you, 19 years of being president of a small university in Lubbock, Texas. I can tell you 3 distinct times, that people around me whom I really trusted said, this is the way you've got to go. This is a decision you've got to make. And deep down, I did not think it was right. Deep down, I thought, no, I just don't think this is the right thing to do. But in each of those 3 times, I thought, these are good people advising me. And I went with their advice. And all of those times, each of the 3 turned out badly. Because I didn't have the fortitude to stand for what I really thought and be all by myself. I would have been all by myself, the only one. But I'm telling you, when you've been praying about something for a long time, and it comes to this feeling inside, this is what I ought to do, you better stay with it. And we're living in a world it's getting worse and worse, I think, at least in my lifetime. It's not been what Jesus has gone through. Maybe it's not been as hard as what Pilate's gone through. I don't know. But everybody wants you to follow the wrong way. Everybody around you, except for a very few. And the question that comes for us is, do we have the courage? Do we have the courage to stand? And my feeling of Pilate is one of such sorrow. I feel sorry for him. At one point I liked him. And then I get so disgusted because, Pilate, you should have gone down with the ship. You should have gone down with the ship. They might have taken Jesus and crucified anyway, and they might have crucified you with him, but you should have said, I will not do what I know is wrong. It's just the courage to stand. And that's the only thing I want to make a point of this morning in this lesson. That you and I go forth into this world that is more and more hostile toward those of us who try to live for Christ. And we have the courage to stand. Now with that, just for a moment, turn your attention to Jesus before we take our communion. Because that beating, I don't know what I'd have done. But he had the courage to stand. Do you understand this? Pilate didn't. And Ken hasn't on many occasions. But he had the courage to stand. In a beating that is so horrible that he did not waver. And he kept on. And he endured. And if you want to know why, I'll remind you of what I just said a moment ago. Because he thought it had nothing to do with him. He thought it had nothing to do with him. He knew it had everything to do with all of us. And so he had the courage to endure what he endured so that we could have life with him forever and forever. And that's the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ.